In the last video, I covered the Estranged Parents channel, where Diane talks about being estranged by her daughter. In that video, there's a segment with jarring statistics that seems out of place with the rest of the video. After watching the video that I'm going to cover today, I now think this was tacked on there when the video was close to being finished because Diane saw a way she could possibly position herself as a pundit on the topic of estrangement. The video is called What's Behind the Estrangement Epidemic. It opens with more stats on estrangement over black and white stock footage. These stats were taken from a national poll saying that 29% of Americans are estranged, 95% of the estrangement is initiated by the adult children, and estrangement lasts an average of 4.5 years. She uses these stats to support the idea that estrangement is an epidemic. Diane says she is going to share her ideas on why the estrangement epidemic is occurring. It's not based on anything scientific. She then goes into homeroom teacher mode, sternly cautioning against any criticism of her.
My goal here is to present some unique viewpoints for your consideration, and you can let me know what you think down in the comments. But please, watch the entire video before you start banging away on the keyboard, and please, be polite.
Diane says she is going to take you on a generational journey and states for context she is older Gen X. After watching the whole video, I still don't know why we need to know that, but I'm guessing Diane just doesn't want people labeling her a boomer. She says that estrangement is a symptom of much larger societal issues and uses a book from 1997 called The Fourth Turning to support the idea that we are facing a total collapse of society. According to the book, patterns of history repeat every 80 to 100 years. The pattern unfolds in 4 stages: awakening, prosperity, unraveling, and crisis. According to the theory, we are currently in the 4th turning, which is the crisis stage. Diane goes over the past generations: baby boomer, Gen X, millennial.
I think summer from 1964 to 1984 during the Consciousness Revolution, which was an anti-establishment cultural awakening. Gen X was born into this era with roughly 65 million of us still here in the US. Now, as Gen Xers, we grew up with the fear of nuclear annihilation. We saw stagflation and Watergate. In the 70s, we saw the end of the Cold War, the rise of MTV.
She spends a lot of time here going over all the differences and contributions of each generation. She points to the rise of individualism starting in the 1960s and how values changed as a result. And this whole idea of postmodern society and individualism destroying the nuclear family has been thrown around a lot. Joshua Coleman, who wrote the book Rules of Estrangement, talks about this a lot, as does researcher Kylie Aglias. Diane says family estrangement is simply a symptom of societal decay.
Almost 1/3 of families are experiencing estrangement. It's like we're losing the heart and soul of America, that can-do, work-together spirit that made this country great. Many individual and collective decisions over the years have led us to the unintended consequences that we are now facing, including parental estrangement, which is just another nail in the coffin of Western civilization.
She then goes over 7 more of her symptoms, and this is more of her spitballing. The first she goes over is the rise of individualism, saying that it's divisive and leading to rigid thinking, labeling people by their generation or political or social ideology.
This channel is not for the angry mob of outraged geeks who rove the internet looking for targets to name, shame.
It's awkward that Diane would point to divisiveness when she seems to focus more on the differences between the generations in this video rather than common ground. She then cites institutional corruption, meaning the education system is promoting individualism and woke ideology. I did see some studies that cited a correlation between estrangement and higher education, but no studies citing it as a cause of civilization collapse. If you remember in the first video, Diane claims her daughter's reasons for estranging her were due to political differences, and Diane insists she isn't that political at all, though no one really seemed to buy that it was really about political differences. But in this video, she sounds almost like a reactionist. The idea a lot of conservatives have that universities are indoctrinating liberal views is not a new one. At this point, I started wondering if Diane really feels this way, or if she's simply mishmashing together ideas for the sake of pandering. Next, she cites declining work ethic, saying the youth today is apathetic and entitled due to economic climate and government handouts.
Who wouldn't want a universal basic income so that, you can sit around and make TikToks and play games all day?
Next is fading family values, saying the culture favors alternative lifestyles over the traditional family. This is still all part of the postmodernism breaking down the nuclear family concept. She goes back to talking about government handouts, saying because people are on the dole, they don't rely on family as much. She makes no mention of adult children who are receiving income from employment, as if everyone under 45 simply can't hold down a job. And also no mention as to other reasons someone might not talk to their parents other than needing help with their bills. I'd say if you are only talking to your parents because your power is about to be shut down, there's probably other issues happening there. She also says if kids are getting help from outside sources, they don't feel obligated to help those that raised them.
When nuclear families are destroyed and government steps in to pick up the slack, a chain of events begins in society that eventually leads to adult children feeling free to delete family from their lives with zero sense of obligation to the people who raised them.
Her next symptom is social media tribalism. She says social media is creating a mob-like mentality. This whole idea, in a way, neutralizes her listing individualism as a symptom because individualism is all about self-reliance and not relying on groupthink. Next is mass formation psychosis. This whole idea is basically that people are feeling anxious and strange from what's going on and that they're going to be more susceptible to influence. It's no accident that Diane chooses the phrase mass formation psychosis and not mass hysteria or mass psychogenic illness. Mass formation psychosis is a pseudoscience term that was coined by medical researcher Robert Malone on the Joe Rogan Experience a few years ago. Malone used it to describe what was happening with the COVID vaccines, likening the public's acceptance of getting vaccinated to what happened in Nazi Germany. Diane describes mass formation psychosis as if it's a term listed in the DSM, although it has no place in any psychology textbook. And Diane pretty much just says verbatim what Malone said on the podcast.
This happens when a society of people have become decoupled from one another and have free-floating anxiety. It's because they can't make sense of what's truly happening.
The answer is mass formation psychosis. When you have a society that has become decoupled from each other and has free-floating anxiety and a sense that things don't make sense, we can't understand it.
It only became part of the lexicon after Malone used it, and it was then adopted by anti-vaxxers. People accepted it as a real term because it sounds interchangeable with other terms. Lastly, she lists U.S. fiscal mismanagement as a symptom of societal collapse. She says the U.S. is addicted to spending money on war and other programs, which is making everything more expensive, leading to a lack of trust in our government. This last symptom I don't really have a problem with as far as her citing it as a symptom of societal collapse. But I am wondering if Diane didn't take some of her ideas from an article on Joseph Tainer's book, Collapse of Complex Societies. The book talks about 5 stages of societal collapse, the first 4 having to do with losing faith in institutions, and the last one losing faith in humanity. The article mentions other things Diane brings up in this video, like postmodernism and the government being addicted to spending money. Still, I don't think it fundamentally has anything to do with estrangement. Diane wraps up the video saying all these things point to unrest and anxiety amongst youth who find safety with community online and at school, and these groups are encouraging the woke ideology and demand strict allegiance. While watching this video, I kept thinking, is she ever going to address the reasons most estranged children and family therapists list as why estrangement happens? Things like abuse, breakdown in communication, divorce, narcissistic parenting. She does talk about generational differences, which is a big issue. Generational differences often do cause a lot of tension between family members, but I think it's more about how they react and respond to these differences that determines if they will still want to talk to each other. It seems counterproductive to omit these things, but I think she's trying hard not to trigger her core audience. The only time she even alludes to any of these things is at the very end.
So, my estranged friends, beyond the mistakes we made as parents, estrangement is just another symptom of substantial societal decay.
That's it. That's all she says. Mistakes we made as parents. She closes it by saying we need to start having real conversations, which I think a lot of people would agree. But I think viewing this situation through a political slant or lens will only further alienate adult children, especially if some of the tensions in the family do revolve around personal and ideological differences. She's pretty much giving people a pass to view their children as entitled and ignorant of history. It would probably be more helpful to bring the more uncomfortable truths of family estrangement to light. Diane's refusal to look at these problems reminded me of how she just cast the Coleman book Rules of Estrangement aside. I think initially Diane started to take Coleman's ideas seriously because of how pro-estranged parent he is. Coleman is an estranged parent himself, and he often takes the side of the parents in his talks, but he does give pretty reasonable advice on mistakes parents make when seeking reconciliation. There's a whole section in the book, and we know that Diane read this chapter because she opens to it in the video. So now I want to go over what those mistakes are. The first is thinking in terms of what's fair, focusing on what you've done for the child, how much time you spent, how much money you've spent. Parents need to get past the idea that because they raised them, they have obligation to them. I'm a parent and I agree with this. I never spend time or anything on my son thinking I'll get something back for it. Coleman also says focusing on what you've done for the child leads to rumination and resentment. We see Diane struggle with rumination and resentment a lot in the first video. The next mistake is guilt-tripping the child. He says it's probably one of the worst things you can do, as it will only drive them farther away. We see many examples of Diane guilt-tripping her daughter throughout the first video. The whole video is about expressing her dismay over the situation. The next mistake is returning fire with fire. So an example would be saying something sharp or criticizing to your child when they say something disrespectful to you. You should try to remain calm and civil to rise above the situation. The next mistake is thinking it will all be over quickly, as most reconciliations are years in the process. We see Diane making this mistake in the opening of the first video. I'd also like to point out that Diane is aware that estrangement lasts an average of 4.5 years, according to the national poll. But after only 2 years, she starts to think of her daughter as dead. She tries to move on from trying to reconcile, and instead focuses on getting support from outsiders. The last one is assuming it's all about you. While we don't know what Diane's actual thought process was while she was struggling with her daughter going no contact with her, she sure does make it all about herself in that video. Under different circumstances, Diane could be seen as a woman trying to find community amongst others going through the same situation. The idea of a community for estranged parents is actually really great. There are a lot of parents who could benefit from support and understanding. Losing a child in any circumstances must be impossibly difficult, and I imagine probably hard to talk about with just anyone. Although Diane couldn't really offer advice, she could seek advice from other parents. But if all she really wanted was solidarity for herself and other parents, she could have just created a Discord or something and been done with it. Perhaps it's not too late to salvage the idea of a community, but it really depends on Diane's motives. It'll be interesting to see if she takes another look at the feedback she's getting and decides to change the direction of the channel, or if she continues to double down. So those are my thoughts on the video, What's Behind the Estrangement Epidemic. I really appreciate all your feedback. It really means a lot. I'll see you next time.